The speaker is Professor Samy Cohen, who is a senior research fellow at CERI, which is the Center for International Studies and Research, Sciences Po, Paris, France. He's teaching the doctorate school at Sciences Po, Paris. He's author or editor of more than a dozen books, among which are Democracies at War Against Terrorism, in comparative perspective, he was the editor, The Resilience of the State, Democracy and Challenges of the Globalization, Mitterrand, and The End of the Cold War, which was published in French, and a few other books which were published in French on politics and issues of international relations and security. The last one, or the first one, was The Defeat of the Generals, the Political Power and the Army under the Fifth Republic. I say the first one because that was published in 1994. So he's a well-known scholar in this field. He's an Israeli-French person. He speaks Hebrew and French. What language should we choose here? Hebrew or French? Don't worry. It's going to be English. It's going to be English because the book was published in English. And the book is called Israel's Asymmetric Wars, which describes the history of Israel's war against terrorism and Israel's war against the Palestinians and Israel's involvement in the international conflict in the Middle East since the establishment of the state. I'll read to you a few lines of one of the readers of the book who wrote the following. An important and critical analysis of Israel's asymmetrical warfare against the Palestinians since its inception in 1948. The author rejects claims that Israel has used state terror or internationally targeted civilians as did other states, such as Russia or France, when conducting counterinsurgencies. Rather, he critiques the IDF for ignoring the basic rules of asymmetrical warfare, namely the use of minimum force. So I guess we'll hear a lot about this concept of the use of minimum force. Dissociate civilians from combatants and seek to change hearts and minds. This is an important book for anyone interested in asymmetrical conflicts. It provides both a thoughtful examination of Israeli strategy and balanced analysis of the causes for its failure. This is only one out of several critiques or comments that were published on the back cover of the book, and I urge you to read the book. But maybe I'll urge you once again, or maybe I will not have to do that after we'll listen to the speaker. So Samy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First, thank you very much, Joran, for having invited me to make this presentation. Second, I would like to tell you a secret. Please do not repeat it to anybody. I have a hearing problem. So, may I ask you if you have questions and or critics to speak up a little bit? And those especially young students who used to speak as fast as a jet, can you please a little bit slow down and everything will be all right? You don't have to shout or to scream, just to speak up a little bit and that will be fine. Well, firstly, I would like to focus on one main point, that this book is not on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as such. It focuses on the strategies used by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in its fight against armed groups since the creation of the State of Israel. Since then, its civilians have regularly been attacked by Palestinian armed groups. You know, probably all of you, the history attack of the 50s with the infiltrators, the 70s with the attacks perpetrated by Black September, the one of the 90s after the Oslo agreements, the wave of the suicide attacks that causes nearly 1,000 deaths during the Second Intifada, and then since these last 10 years, the rocket attacks on the south of Israel against the cities and villages. So this presentation tries to answer two questions. How has Israel reacted and responded to this attack? How has it managed this type of conflict that can be described as asymmetric? And second, to what extent its strategy has been suited and adapted to the asymmetric war the country has engaged in. Second, I'd like to underline that this presentation is not trying to justify and not to condemn, but trying to understand and explain, even though the outcome are often critical. This work is the result of research conducted in Israel from 2005 to 2010, and it's based on written documentation as well on more than 16 depth interviews with IDF officers and simple soldiers, senior counter-terrorism officials, politicians, journalists, academics, and NGOs. And myself, I served in the army during 6 years, and I know many of the people who are in charge now as civilian or as military. Now let's go to the heart of the matter. How is the IDF respond to the asymmetric conflict? Let me remind briefly that what is asymmetric conflict. You know probably most of you what is it, but I would like just to remind briefly some points. One of them is that asymmetric conflict do not oppose weak parties, non-state actors, insurgents, guerrillas, terrorists, to strong actors, states that enjoy military superiority. It's also usually a war amongst the population. The armed groups tend to act with disguised as civilian, and they use the population as human shields. Their strategy aims at provoking the regular armies into shooting upon civilians. If they succeed in triggering disproportionate responses to the attacks, the terrorists will claim they have won the game, they have proved the lack of humanity of the state they fight. That would justify attacking its population. It's also essentially a psychological warfare which tends more to destroy the enemy's morale than its forces. And it's also a conflict where the media and the domestic and the international public opinion have an important role to play. This kind of warfare is also asymmetric for a legal standpoint, as well democracies are supposed to respect fundamental treaties such as the Hague and the Geneva Convention, which establish clear limits to the use of armed forces by states, while the asymmetric warriors feel entitled to do everything. So what can a state do in such a situation? Some authors, like Martin van Creveld and Andrew Mack, said they are destined to lose this type of war, and I don't agree completely, because we have to keep in mind that many insurgencies have been defeated by states. The Greek communists in 1944, the Chinese insurgency in Malaysia in 1953. Some have been crushed in bloody crackdown in authoritarian regimes. Look now what happening is what happened in Syria in 1982, what is going on now, what Saddam Hussein did in his country against its own population, what the Algerian government do against its population in the fight against terrorism in the 90s. We have to remind that even France during the Algerian war in the 50s fought very harshly terrorism, and thanks to General Massoud's forceful measures, massive torture, rape, thousands of missing persons, he has overcome terrorism in Algeria. Then there is hence at least one winning strategy, the one of terror. But what can do a democracy that is repelled by the idea of attacking civilians in a large scale? Is there another alternative? Many democracies had adopted the strategy called the strategy of minimum force. What is it exactly? It has been developed by the British at the beginning, and then by the French, and now adopted more and more by the American Marine. The minimum force implies two principles of action. The first one is that the civilian population is crucial for success. The population is the strategic center of gravity. And I want to quote David Galula. David Galula was an officer during the Algerian War in the 50s. Then he went to France after when the war ended, and he made his PhD, and he published a book, Counterinsurgency Warfare, Theory and Practice. This book became, this last year, the bedside book of General Petraeus, and he used his arguments and his proposals in the war against the insurgencies in Iraq. And what David Galula is saying two things. He's saying what makes it possible for the guerrilla to survive and to expand? The complicity of the population. One of the main objectives of the fight against the guerrilla movement must hence to be gain the active support of this population in order to separate it from the combatants, deprive the fish of its water. End of quote. And the second core principle is to use armed force with as much restraint as possible. In this type of war, the massive use of overwhelming force is counterproductive. It only serves the enemy. To be honest and realistic, most of the countries that try to use the minimum force, they don't. It's not a huge success. Why? Because they have this is strategy not very easy to carry out. Democracy have to face many difficulties in applying it. First, it's not very easy to fight in urban area without taking the risk of harming civilians. I've interviewed many soldiers that were in Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. They all said we made sometimes our best to avoid to harm civilians, but sometimes there is a confusion and we make mistakes, and we cannot do in another way. This is a real problem. The other one that is that the military generally has hard time adapting to this sort of mission, which places civilian at the center of their preoccupation. They are more or less trained to conventional war and not of this type of war. And lastly, democracies often commit human rights violations organized by their own political leaders and security agencies, including brutal treatment of prisoners, abuse and torture. What happened at Abu Ghraib is one of what happened even in this prison at close to Cuba, Guantanamo. It's a good example of a government who gave the order to torture prisoners. But the fact is that for democracies, brutal behavior against civilians often weakens the counter-terrorist struggle. It delegitimizes all the efforts made to gain international support. It offers these groups an excuse for their acts, and as noted by Walzer, I quote, it supplies them with the small number of additional recruits needed to sustain the terrorist activities. End of quote. Having said that, let's get back to Israel. I'd like to stress that first, the Israeli army has not chosen the strategy of terror. That I want to make it completely clear. It has not chosen the strategy of terror leading to massive destruction and widespread atrocity. Contrary to what the Palestinian leaders said, there were no massacres at Jenin during Defense Shield operation in 2002. Neither in 2008 during Cascade operation. There is no evidence of intentional killings as the Judge Goldstone reported, there are nevertheless evidence of individual cases of war crimes, and these cases, some of them have been brought to courts and will be judged. Some other of them, they are still inquired, and the inquiries are conducted by the Israeli General Military Prosecutor, which has a very hard time because he's every time he opens an inquiry against an alleged crime war, he's attacked by the extreme right in Israel. His house was attacked by militants of the extreme right, which is something unbelievable in Israel, where the army is usually a sacred cow, but probably it's not a sacred cow for everybody. But the IDF has not neither chosen the strategy of minimum force. It has yet chosen the disproportionate response. This doctrine has been unofficially the army since the creation of Israel as a state. Its aim is, among others, to put pressure on the civilian population in order to compel it to act against the terrorist groups. The IDF has never excluded the option of using overwhelming force in inhabited and built-up areas. In its eyes, it has, on the contrary, been the only way to protect its own population and to eliminate groups that are less organized than themselves, but nevertheless hard to defeat. This strategy, well, we see that for Galula, the population is crucial, and you have to bring them close to you. From the idea, the population is crucial, but you have to put pressure on them. Not exactly the same strategy. This strategy can also be called the leverage strategy. It was the word, I think, Yoram, you will tell me if I'm right. This term was invented during the Second Intifada by the army. Can be seen during most of the important confrontation between Israel and irregular groups. It is an unchanging element. It has been unofficially claimed by the army to be the best possible strategy in the fight against the guerrillas. Second, the results of such a strategy have been globally counterproductive. Instead of soothing the violence, it has fed it. It has nearly always led to the death of innocent Arab civilians and has exacerbated anti-Israeli feelings and caused to retaliation. It has every time led to an escalation difficult to control, and each time a tougher enemy was created. Moreover, it has nearly always presented Israel, the aggressed party, as the aggressor. Well, this will lead me later on to the main point. How can this persistence can be explained? Well, I want to go back to some examples. I cannot detail all of them, of course, because I don't have the time for this. I apologize. I have to simplify and to limit myself to some significant cases. I take the fight against the infiltrators during the 50s, Peace for Galilee in 1982, in the Second Intifada, and lastly, Caslet Operation, because it will make a real debate between us, I imagine. The infiltrator. I started with the infiltrators because the disproportionate response has been used already then, during the 50s, against them. At the beginning, they were infiltrated, and Palestinians who live across the border, and who infiltrated Israel and tried to come back to Israel. They were at the beginning not aggressive, and they became more and more aggressive, and they attacked, robbed, and killed Israeli farmers. From the beginning, the Israeli response was brutal and poorly controlled. The rules of engagement the High Command issued to the field unit were increasingly permissive. The units were authorized to shoot at any Arab crossing the border without warning. The main fear of the Israeli side was that infiltrators might become permanent immigrants, thus increasing the number of Arabs in Israel. General Moshe Dayan, chief of Southern Command at the time, when he was criticized about its orders, he said, I quote, Arabs crossed the border to collect the grain and they left in the abandoned villages, and we set mines for them and they returned without an arm or a leg. It may be that this cannot pass review, but I know no other methods of guarding the border. If the shepherds and harvesters are allowed to cross the border, then tomorrow the state of Israel will have no border. Later on, he was criticized by some other member of the Israeli government, the moderate one, like Moshe Sharet, about the leverage strategy. And he answered, I quote, the only method that proved effective, not justified or moral, but effective, when Arabs plant mines on our side, it's retaliation. If we try to search for that particular Arab who planted mines, it has no value. But if we harass the nearby village, then the population there comes out against the infiltrators. The method of collective punishment so far has proved effective. There are no other effective method to counter infiltration. End of quote. Well, the method was, however, not totally effective. The humiliation that it generated fostered further attacks against Israel. Several attacks was carried out by the IDF against villages located beyond the water. The most lethal one was committed at Kibbeh in October 1953, when 69 men, women, and children were killed, and the operation was contained by the United Nations Security Council by the Israelis, allies, among them France at the same period. Well, the same pattern, the same strategy had been applied against the PLO when the PLO reorganized itself in the Palestinian camps in South Lebanon and began to launch attacks against Israeli villages near the border. Well, the Israeli operational modes were air raids and artillery fire, and these bombings do not only aim at killing Palestinian combatants and destroying their hiding places, they are also to create a climate of fear among the civilian population, the Lebanese civilian population in South Lebanon, in order to push it toward the north of the country. The hope is indeed that this exodus will turn the Lebanese against the Palestinian presence on their soil. And we have the strategy was applied in 1978 with Litani operation, which was a small operation compared to Peace for Galilee in 1982. Peace for Galilee is considered by everybody in Israel as a huge disaster. There were thousands of civilians and hundreds of Israeli soldiers were killed for nothing. There was no civil dimension to this operation. The idea of winning hearts and minds, albeit still possible at the time, was completely neglected by Israeli strategy. It was presumed that the civilian population would welcome the Israeli troops as liberators. It is true that during the first day of the operation, the Israeli troops were received in South Lebanon by Shiite population, tossing rice to show their eagerness to get rid of the Palestinian armed groups. But the welcome would not last long. Very rapidly, the population turned itself against Israel. It's during this period that a new Shiite force appears, as you know, the Hezbollah, supported by Iran. Consequently, the whole of the northern neighborhood of Israel became a hostile environment. Israel lost its good relation with the Christian as well as with Shiites. And finally, in the eyes of international public opinion, Peace for Galilee appeared as no less than a war of aggression. How can the second Intifada be assessed? Well, for some Israeli experts, it's a clear-cut victory. I think that we could make an assessment more balanced. Why? Because on one hand, the terrorist organization has not succeeded in destabilizing the Israeli democracy. The Israeli public has resisted the shock of Syrian state attack, but nevertheless, most of the Israeli public opinion moved to the right. Then, thanks mostly to the policy of preventive arrest, the security forces have succeeded in reducing the number of terrorist attacks without resorting to the methods developed by the French army in Algeria or by the British army in South Africa and in Kenya. But on the other hand, the relations with the population were severely damaged. There have been significant number of civilian losses among the population. The IDF retaliated severely. According to the Israeli head of military intelligence, less than 1 month after the beginning of the confrontation, the army had shot more than 1 million bullets. The Lieutenant General Aviv Kochavi was at that time commander of the paratrooper at the beginning of the Second Intifada, claimed later in 2003 that the IDF had neither a doctrine nor adequate techniques for low-intensity combat in densely populated urban areas. But probably the worst mistake was the weakening of the Palestinian Authority. It has contributed to the fragmentation of Palestinian society. The weakening of the PA has allowed for radical organizations such as Hamas and the Islamic Jihad to strengthen their position, thus making any negotiation very complicated. The situation that we have today, where the Palestinian society is split in two and maybe more than two parts, is the result of this, the fight and the strategy of this period. I would like now to say some words about, and more than some words about Qassam operation. Its aim was officially to stop the Qassam attack. It was legitimate defense. The IDF entering Gaza Strip with huge forces, more than 10,000 soldiers, tanks, aircrafts. The strategy was again the disproportionate response and of the leverage. Tzipi Livni, who was at the time Minister of Foreign Affairs, said officially, we can be very brutal when our citizens are attacked. I'm translating brutal because in Israel, אנחנו יכולים להיות מאוד פראים. פראים can be brutal and savage. It's I don't know which one I have to choose, which translation I have to choose. I would say it's more savage than brutal. I will tell you why. I'll tell you why. The number of the civilian casualties was very important, albeit there is a discussion, a controversial, between the NGO, the Israeli NGO, and the numbers given by the army, who give numbers who show that the civilian casualties were less important than what the NGO said. But many people told me, some people told me, well, what do you complain about? The IDF has succeeded to obtain deterrence against the Hamas. I think that this is a very controversial and important point, and a very controversial point. Because the attacks never stop. Regularly, you have cycle of violence. Since then, they shoot, Israel respond, and they shoot more and more, and that it can last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then it stops, and it started again. Second, the radical groups, as Islamic Jihad and some other small groups, they are stronger and stronger, and they emerge as a new nuisance. Third, the Hamas has kept a significant potential for nuisance. Not only the potential of their troops were not significantly reduced, but they are more and more powerful in the rockets they have. And the Israeli army think they might have more sophisticated rocket and rocket again plane, which is very annoying for the IDF. I would say, that Israel is also determined. Nobody is thinking about that. But now, during this last month and this last 2 years, the government and the Israeli army, they are very careful. Several times they have said, we cannot do another Cascade operation, not now. About the legitimate defense, I would say that during this last 10 years, the Israeli population in the south of Israel was attacked. It's not a new problem. My friends are living in Netiv Asara, close to the fence, and we left. We stayed there with her and with them, and we saw how difficult the life is there. But I wonder about the legitimate defense. Why the legitimate defense only occurred in 2008 and not earlier? What not in 2004 and 2005? 2005 was the disengagement, but it couldn't occur earlier. I think that there was a real problem in Israel since the Lebanese war in 2006. I visit Israel several times and I speak to many people, civilians, military, and all of them. You felt in Israel a strong feeling of frustration, of humiliation. Israel has lost more than 130 soldiers in the south of Lebanon. You know the story. The Israeli army was not well prepared and has no good strategy, and the response was not adequate. So there was a strong feeling, a need of revenge against and to restore the deterrent. In Israel, you have always the same story. We have to restore deterrent. So how many times you have to restore deterrent? If you say every 2 years or 3 years, we have to restore deterrence, you have to think about the notion of deterrent. Is it working, and why is it not working? Maybe it's not working. You have to choose to think about something else, another strategy. So, in 2008, there was, how do you say, the academics say, a window of opportunity. Obama was not yet officially the president. Bush was not officially the president. So there was a room of 2 or 3 weeks where Israel could operate more or less with a great margin of maneuver. When you read all the articles during 2008, people from the left, like Yaron London, people from the Labour Party, as the Deputy Minister of the of Defense, I don't remember his name, they said awful things. They said we have to make a second Shoah to the Palestinians. Yaron London, who is a journalist very well known, who is militant in peace movement, he said we have to go there without gloves and to hurt population. This is not the problem. This cannot be that it must not be an obstacle to an operation against the Hamas. This is new. For me, it's new. I've never heard such awful mood, general mood. Well, and then we got a particular situation in in custody operation. All of you know that Goldstone published an interview in April 2001 when he said, "If I had known then what I know, the report would have been a different document." He referred to all the inquiries opened by the general military prosecutor. And he said civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. He came back to what he said in this report, happily. But still, the interview do not get deeply to the fact what happened and how, why so many civilians killed. Nobody has the whole image of the whole inquiries open. The Israeli army do not cooperate with internationally. And we have a particular situation where the idea do not target civilian intentionally. That, for me, it's completely clear. But at the same time, this kind of operation can kill civilians, and it is foreseeable. Sometimes it's not foreseeable, like the young soldier who make just a mistake. But if you go in such dense populated area with so many forces, it's inevitable that you will have hundreds of civilians killed. Well, of course, the IDF asked the population concerned by an imminent attack to leave their homes. This is a very good and moral behavior, but to distribute leaflets or messages urging people to evacuate does not make them leave their home automatically. Many people cannot move as easily. The attachment to one's home is often stronger than the fears to lose one's life in an air raid. The warning leaflets do not free the armed forces from the obligation to take all precautions when it comes to the safety of the civilian population. This warning can lead to pernicious effects. Soldiers may think, and they said it, they may think that following the warning, the area is completely evacuated and that the only people who stay are Hamas combatants. Besides, following the protest, the international protest against this operation, the army has admitted that next time they will prepare corridors where the population can use to escape, because in some places they do not know where to escape. The place is small, so small and tight. Well, that means that there was a problem. It was to admit that there was a problem. So many times people ask, so what do you suggest? What is the solution? Of course, Israel, the army, has the obligation to defend its population. There is no discussion about this. But I would say, first, avoid the trap put by the irregular troops, because they invite the IDF to get inside Israel. The Tzahal said, but they were hiding in mosques, and of course they hide in civilian houses, and they hide in hospitals. But gentlemen, all the irregular groups make the same thing since not 100 years. It's the basic principle of the asymmetric war. It's the combatant hide in civilian population and invite you to shoot on their civilians in order to show how inhuman you are. So I would say, don't fall into this trap. This is the one of the main principles. The second main principle is to choose, to prefer, when it's possible, a defensive strategy. The RAND Corporation published a very interesting inquiry in 2008, in December 2008. They studied all the hundreds of cases of terrorism, or fight against terrorism and state. And they showed that the better way, the better means to overcome the problem of terrorism is first not military forces. Military forces succeed only in 10% of cases. More than 35% of cases was a success, following the fact that when you use police and information means that you you use defensive, police means, information means, it's much more useful. And they concluded and said 30% of the cases of confrontation between terrorists and states ended with political agreement. Well, there is the problem of the political agreement. It seems that Israel can win tactically here and there, and not always, but they can win tactically. The Operation Defense Shield was a real success, but a real success even in not only in military means, but even from the human aspect. They make an operation mode who avoid to hurt the civilian. But it was one of the last cases. And when people said, what would you suggest? I always said, well, do what the IDF did in Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. What happened in 2002? They get into Jenin. It was a very dense population, not as Gaza, of course, it was smaller, but they get inside. And at one moment, the one unit was fall in a trap, and they was shot by Palestinian activists, and they asked for military bombings on the quarter. And the Minister of Defense said, no, we're not going to bomb urban areas. Well, this is an answer, and a good example of what we should do. I said we because I feel part of the country. They should do, and of course that means a cost of that can threaten Israeli soldiers. But the problem in Castled operation, that it came just after the Lebanese war, in the second Lebanese war in 2006, and they have chosen to have zero death in the Israeli forces. Of course, this is legitimate if you want, but the consequence, if you want zero death in your forces, that means more death in the civilian population on the other side. And you have to make a real strategic choice. You, in a state like Israel, do not have only to defend its own population. It has global interest. And into this global interest, you have the international interest. You need the support of the public, the international public opinion, the support of your allies, because there are other threats more important than the threat of the Hamas. You have Iran, you have many other threats, and you need their help. You need their support. So the government has to take into consideration that when you build a plan, an operational plan, you have to take into consideration that you have to make it in such a way that you will not, you will succeed also to make an efficient operation and get the support of the ally. And to finish, I would like to say why this refusal to think in different way. Now, France, the British Army, and now the American Army, since 2006, they try. They do not succeed to do it every time, but they try to think in a way of minimum force. Why the Israelis do not integrate it? They have not integrated this kind of thinking, way of thinking. I would say that the first reason is that the strategic priorities elaborated at the top of the state is, in particular of the military hierarchy, is that it's always focused foremost on the scenario of a major conventional war with several Arab countries, and at the same time threatening the very existence of Israel. The asymmetric group seems secondary, not the main challenge for the Israeli existence. Second, I would say there is a central reason which is related to strategic culture. The strategy of disproportionate response is part of the way of thinking, not only of the military, but also of the political leaders and more generally of the society at large. It's part of the country's history, its identity, it's a set of belief, of attitude and practices. Israel has always chosen to retaliate with more force than necessary to guarantee its security. Israel reacts with the brutality of the weak, who fears for his existence, haunted as they are by the new Holocaust, but with the means of the strong, who want to deter anyone who might oppose his will. It has become something like a reactive reflex that is widely shared in the whole country. Well, and third point, the civil and the military leaders have acquired the conviction that any other strategy would risk giving the impression of weakness and would encourage the terrorists to pursue with their violence. This approach would be the only one likely to deter. I discussed many times with generals responsible for counter-terrorism. When I speak about other way of thinking, I said, but you are completely mad. We cannot allow ourselves to do otherwise, because they will think, they will be sure that we are weak, and they will continue in the violence. Nevertheless, the violence continues. Well, to conclude, some last remark. I must say that in this kind of debate, there are no definitive answers and no ideal solution. We have some directions, general directions. Waging asymmetric war is always complex for many reasons. But nevertheless, the civilian and military leaders of a democracy must distinguish themselves clearly from the terrorists. And this was a major problem in Cascade operation. Many people said, well, what is the difference between you and the Hamas? You are doing the same thing. And we have to do in another way. Even if we have losses in among our soldiers, we have to show we are a democracy. We don't use the same means that they use. Even though the IDF never killed intentionally. And lastly, I would say that in asymmetric war, you don't have to be necessarily the stronger or the most moral. Sometimes, in certain exceptional cases, democracy, in my opinion, can use illegal means as targeted killings in certain conditions. In certain conditions where you don't have any other means to defend yourself. Why not? In the war waged against Black September in Europe, I think it was legitimate, completely legitimate, because there was no other means to get rid of this kind of attack. But you have to be not the stronger, but the smarter, and sometimes choose minimum force, defensive measures, not always offensive measures. You have to be creative, inventive. They have been inventive in the West Bank during 2002, but I will conclude by citing Machiavelli, the prince. Machiavelli wrote, "A prince must make himself fear in such a way that if he does not inspire love, at least he doesn't provoke hatred. For it is perfectly possible to be feared and not hated." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samy. Well, we'll have questions now. Yes, please.
I'm not entirely clear as to what your argument is. I'm not entirely clear as to what your argument is. I mean, you should be advocating sort of like a smart power approach, which ends up being sort of meaningless in and of itself, which is to act appropriately in any sort of given situation, right? To be creative. And I don't quite understand what the sort of the practical outcome of a strategy like that is. I know that you had mentioned sort of minimal force and GLULA, and from that you sort of derive what's now known as clear, hold, build, which is the idea is that you send in troops to clear out an area, you keep those troops in that area to sort of secure the loyalty of the population, and then once the population is sort of secure and loyal, you can sort of move on to somewhere else. But that doesn't necessarily imply minimal force. Oftentimes it requires a lot of force to sort of go into an area to eliminate the enemy, and then the force can sort of leave after that. Another sort of possible strategy, the collective punishment strategy, by punishing the civilian population, the idea is to get the civilian population, as you said, to sort of rise up against the rebel force. But in order to do that, the civilian population has to be capable of sort of attacking the rebel force itself. And there it seems like Israel's problem is that it punished the civilian population, but it didn't give the civilian population a means to actually combat the rebels. So you saw that anytime there was punishment, Hamas would basically engage in brutal killing campaigns and sort of exterminate any civilians that had sort of risen up against it. So there are a number of sort of possible strategies, and I didn't quite get the sense that you had linked your what you're advocating to these other sort of possible strategies out there.
Maybe I'm so sorry, I didn't hear everything. Maybe you can just repeat the main question.
He wasn't sure whether do you accept the analysis of the weakness of the present strategy or not? Because you spoke earlier about the alternative. Just say yes or no.
Bad things about sort of collective punishment and overwhelming force, and you said good and bad things about sort of more defensive measures. So it was unclear when it was a good idea to use defensive measures, when it was a bad idea, when it was a good idea to use stronger force, when it was a bad idea.
He wasn't sure about the alternative that you're presenting. I asked you and you didn't answer me whether you agree with the analysis of the weakness of the present policy that Israel is using. Just say yes or no, don't elaborate. The first part of the conversation.
Yes.
All right. So he agrees. So he agrees with he agrees with your criticism of the policies or strategies that were used by Israel. He is not sure about the alternative. He's not sure what you really put forward to the Israelis, how to combat seriously and more effectively in asymmetrical warfare.
Well, I must thank you.
Particularly that the issue is a very serious and uneasy moral question. We heard that Israel should take upon itself to see more Israeli soldiers being killed. Not many Israelis will accept that. So there is a problem there that you have to answer.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure either that the alternative is perfect. I said that most of the Western countries are thinking in this, that this alternative is better, that disproportionate response and massive killings. That's true. I said it at the beginning of my presentation, that it doesn't work every time, but it's better. You know, France have succeeded to overcome the terrorism in Algeria. They have won the war. They have, excuse me, they have lost the war. Until now, the French culture, the French population, and the French army are very affected by this kind of method. The Israeli generals, now they have completely changed, and they don't want to hear about this period, and they want to be very, very, as moral as they can, and to use as minimum force as they can. So I agree that there is no perfect solution. I know there is a very bad solution. The disproportionate response.
Is the solution that you're advocating clear, hold, build, basically Galula's sort of pacification strategy?
Galula is the answer? Pacification? Galula's answer is the answer?
Yes, yes. I really suggest you to read the Galula book, because it has been published in 1964 in English and in 2008 in French. So it's a very interesting book, because it's not at all simplistic. He explained what is always the alternative, what you can do, in what kind of situation you can use the force, and what kind of situation you have to be very careful. What will be the consequences of each step you can take?
So
it's not, you don't have a recipe, the good recipe to fight against terrorism. Nobody has it.
Yes, yes, please.
You recommended some defensive measures, or Israel consider more defensive measures, correct?
Defensive
Speak
measures.
up a little bit.
What sort of
defensive measures you think
Yeah.
would be that Israel should consider it more, correct? What defensive measures do you think work against Qassam and Katyusha rockets?
Okay. I've got you. It's an exception. Several years, 2 years or 3 years before Cascade operation, the Ministry of Defense has taken the decision to build a defensive system against short-range missiles. The decision was taken in 2006, I think, officially. There was a budget for this. And the Ministry of Defense and the Army didn't use this money. They use it for other purposes, for offensive weapons. Following the Cascade operation, the state controller, 3 or 4 months later, he published a report where he severely criticized the Ministry of Defense, which had not used the money to build a defensive countermeasures against the rocket missile. He said, if we had such a defense system, you could avoid to make Cascade operation, and could avoid to all this situation, this bad situation, the international bad international reaction. Following this report, the Ministry of Defense recognized immediately his fault and started to work on the defense missiles. And now they have 3 or 4 batteries of called Iron Domes. They cost a lot of money, of course, because for each Qassam, which cost some $100, each missiles of Iron Dome cost, I think, something like $100,000. So, but it had been deployed, it had been used several times, and many rockets were shot in the air, and the population was protected. But this is only the beginning. Israel is thinking now to deploy more and more defensive missile systems, because you have the threat of the south, but more important, you have the threat of the north, of the Hezbollah, who has thousands of rockets. They can shoot Israel, and they can reach Tel Aviv. So now the main challenge is not to buy some other offensive plane. The problem is not that. It's to defend the population, and to defend it with defensive system anti-missile.
Yes, you in the back, please.
So, all the times when Israel was in wars with terrorist groups, these terrorist groups got something in return. Like after the 2006 war with Lebanon, Hezbollah got soldiers, terrorists or prisoners back, and recently Hamas got prisoners back. So it seems that Israel is not encouraging non-violence from the other parties. And violence is paying off, and they're getting something in return.
Thank you very much. Can you help me a little bit? Many thanks.
The point was that Israel's policies do not encourage lack of use of violence, but even use of more violence, because each time the Palestinians use violence, whether it's the Hamas or Hezbollah, Israel reacted positively. They withdrew from North Lebanon, gave thousands Palestinians prisoners back to the Hamas, etc. So Israel is encouraging the other side to use more violent means.
Do
you agree with that?
This is connected with the release of the prisoners, yeah?
Yes,
That's
I'm
fine,
saying
yeah.
that it's paying off. Like they're getting there.
Well, if you take the release of the Palestinian prisoners to get Gilad Shalit back, this is right that this will encourage more kidnapping. That sure. The Hamas said it. The Hamas even said release more prisoners. Otherwise, we will kidnap more soldiers. I think it's very controversial in the Israeli society. Some of the Israeli people say we cannot leave a soldier into the hand of the enemy, and the other side of the society said, but we are releasing people who are going to start again with terrorism. This is a real question. What you say? I would like my personal mind feelings. It's we should think even more politically. When you release prisoners to Hamas, what is the result? You weaken the Palestinian Authority. So people say, why should we discuss with the Palestinian Authority? The Palestinian Authority says, so why should we discuss? How can we discuss now with the Israeli when the Hamas is the only force who can get something from the Israeli? This is a huge and very difficult problem. I would like to get back, to your to complete my answer to your question. There is another aspect. There is the population of the South demand to spend more money to
improve the shelter system.
Yes, to improve the shelter of the houses, of the schools, and they do it very, very slowly. They don't put the money. There is a sort of I don't know how to explain that. They're not interested in putting money in defensive. I think that the Israeli mentality of the Israeli military mentality, the Israeli culture, is a culture of the offensive. There is an author, an Israeli author, very well known. He was deputy head of the atomic commission, and he said he wrote a very good book in the 60s. He said Israel has the cult of offensive. They can only think in the way of offensive for all kinds of reasons. And well, the fact is that we have to reverse now the way of thinking, because if Israel will attack Iran, the Israeli population will be under fire. Tel Aviv will be under fire. So the problem is how to defend the population. We are not in a context of a global war against states against a state against other states. This is not very actual. The problem is how to defend the Israeli population.
Let me react to that point, and then I'll let you ask the question. Anita Shapira wrote a very good book on the development of Israel's strategic thinking. And she has a phrase which I prefer, the one that you use now. The strategy of Israel is defensive. At best of the middle 30s, they used offensive tactics to achieve this strategic defense. I think that's more sophisticated, and I like it better than just to say that.
I read this book. Yes. You're right.
But it's an open question.
Yes.
Please.
Okay. First of all, I don't think there's any objective observer who would agree with you that Israel has a policy that is more destructive of civilians than any country. I think Israel has been successful in pinpointing military targets, and there's less collateral damage from Israeli strikes than American strikes or anyone else. I mean, we bomb whole compounds in Pakistan and Afghanistan. I don't think there's any question but that Israel is more careful. Secondly, you can't have just a purely defensive strategy relying on Iron Dome and Arrow. That only works for a few rockets being shot at you. If you have a whole mass of rockets, it's ineffective. And only if Israel can suppress wholesale rocket attacks does the Iron Dome system work. But even then, the population is still terrorized because some are getting through. Now, you can argue that the problem with Gaza, with the rockets, is that Israel only adopted a defensive strategy and only pinpointed terrorists firing rockets. And the mass of people in Gaza have lived terror-free, while in Sderot and other places in southern Israel, the people are living in terror. And perhaps if you answered in kind, if Israel answered in kind to the population in Gaza, the situation would stop. And I'm not saying that they should fire indiscriminately without giving warning in Gaza, but perhaps if every time some rockets were fired into southern Israel, Israel sent out a 20-second warning saying rockets are coming, and then fired some rockets into Gaza, which could hit civilians, but they were given warning, they would live in terror like the people in southern Israel, and they would stop firing rockets. But instead, you see, they're willing to... Can I have 10 seconds?
I see that some students are beginning to leave. I don't want the others to leave.
Okay, I'm sorry.
We have to finish now?
Yeah,
I
that's the
forgot.
last question. It's 1:45.
Oh, I see. So let's take another question, and you'll answer both at the same time. Yes, please.
Obviously, the majority of the strategies and things you've
the majority of the strategies and things you've been discussing are military-based and oriented, but have you thought of other approaches in the home base in Israel and then reaching outwards to surrounding countries and maybe even focusing on the children in those countries?
So you are suggesting non-military,
No, I'm just asking if you've thought of other options as well.
which are non-military.
Such as education.
Right, like education.
Okay. So, about the collateral damages, well, it depends. Sometimes the IDF succeed to minimize collateral damages when they attack very precisely a small groups who is going to shoot, and they're doing a very good job because they have information. They have the good information in the good time, in the right time. But this is not, Castad was not the same thing. No, the Israeli army at the beginning said we are not shooting phosphor shell in urban areas. That's what they say. It has proven that it was not true. And two of the high-ranking officers were blamed for this. They are shot in urban areas. This is illegal from the international law. Well, about the Americans, they make more collateral damage. This kind of question, I've heard it, the comparison with the American, the comparison with other countries. I don't really like it. Do you know why? Because I think that we have to be better than the Americans. Why do we choose the worst cases? Let's try to choose.
No, the Americans are the best case comparing against. If you want to talk about Grozny, that's the worst case. But Israel is better than anyone, including the best case.
Well, I'm not sure. Not in Castad operation. No, I'm not sure at all. I'm not sure that in the second Lebanese war this was the case. No. The scale is not the same scale because the American used huge forces in Afghanistan, and from time to time they make collateral damage, but I must say all the last cases they apologize. I think a democracy has to apologize. Israel used to do this. I remember when in 2006 when the Prime Minister Olmert, the army shoot a shell on a building, and there was a mistake of the system of the tank, and intentionally the bomb fall in a house and killed 22 people. Olmert apologized, and I think this is the right thing to do. At Castad operation, there was no apology when they shoot over the house of this doctor, who is a Palestinian, who is a militant of peace. He was working in Israel. He's operating in Israeli hospital. They shoot onto her house without good reasons. They never apologized. They said, you are guilty. You are responsible because you stay there, and we warned you that we are going to shoot. This is not a very good behavior. About the last question, not military. I think yes, Israel. The problem that apart the Oslo Accords and the attempt of Ehud Olmert to develop an agreement with Mahmoud Abbas, there is no political strategy to finish the conflict with the Palestinians. And I think there is no other way. If you want to weaken the Hamas, the only way is to show the population that there in the West Bank they will get something, improving of their economical life, they will get a state, they will get something. If you continue not to support Mahmoud Abbas, you will have nothing. This is the kind of, you have to give something to get the support of the population. And then the Hamas will be isolated. If the Hamas is isolated, you can beat him. That's what the guerrilla said. That's what the guerrilla said. Separate the population from the terrorists. He said it's not a problem to kill terrorists. It's very easy. The problem is the population. If you kill civilians, you are in a problem.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we have to end here because there is another class in 5 minutes. I thank you for coming. I thank you for talking to us. We can stay informally for another 15 minutes here if anybody wants to stay and talk. Thank you.